I want to jump right in today and just ask you, the person listening to this right now, have you ever stared at a problem all day long? Like, just banged your head against the wall?
Oh, we have all been there. It is the worst feeling.
Right, you're trying so hard and you just give up in absolute frustration. You go to bed and then you wake up the next morning with the answer just, well, seemingly handed to you on a silver platter.
It's wild when that happens. It feels almost unearned.
Exactly. Well, today we are exploring a really fascinating document. It's titled Dreams and Discovery Docs. And our mission here is to unpack how the unconscious, dreaming mind has actually served as a literal engine of discovery.
Yeah, for some of history's absolute greatest scientific and philosophical breakthroughs, no less.
Which is crazy to think about because, we live in this modern, enlightenment-driven world, and it essentially trains us to view sleep as a void.
Right, like an off switch.
Yeah, an off switch. To us, dreams are just neural noise, just a bizarre release of the day's residue. We associate real knowledge and real breakthroughs with, well, with tension.
Oh, absolutely. We picture a whiteboard covered in complex equations, or like a programmer fueled by black coffee at 2 in the morning.
The muscle of the mind flexing.
Yes, exactly. We really believe that knowledge has to be earned through the sheer force of conscious waking will. But the historical evidence we are going to explore today, it totally upends that assumption.
It flips it completely on its head.
It really does. The architectural structures of our modern scientific world, things you rely on every single day, were in some cases quite literally pulled out of the dark, out of the realm of sleep.
I love that framing. So let's start right at the bedrock of our modern intellectual world. Because to understand how foundational the dreaming mind is, we actually have to look at the guy who basically invented the modern concept of waking reason.
Right, we have to look at René Descartes.
Yes, Descartes. Set the scene for us.
So the critical date here is November 10th, 1619. And to really grasp what happens on this night, we need to understand the precarious state of European thought at the time. And Descartes' own state of mind.
He was pretty young. Right?
He was 23, just 23 years old. He had volunteered as a soldier in the army of the Duke of Bavaria. This is during the early stages of the 30 Years' War.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and winter is setting in. The army is basically stalled, so he is holed up in this tiny stove-heated room. He called it a poe, just trying to stay warm. But he isn't just cold. He is enduring this profound intellectual crisis.
So set the stakes for that crisis. I mean, what exactly was a 23-year-old soldier agonizing over in a tiny heated room?
Well, he was looking at the entire state of human knowledge and realizing it was just a chaotic mess. The old medieval scholastic systems were crumbling around them.
Right.
And the scientific revolution was just starting to crack the foundation of how people viewed the universe. But there was no unified method to determine what was actually true.
It was all just fragmented.
Completely fragmented. Descartes was desperately seeking a single absolute foundation for all human knowledge. He wanted a method of reasoning that was as undeniable as a mathematical proof.
Which is a huge task for a 23-year-old.
Right. He was working himself into a state of sheer exhaustion, trying to find a starting point that simply could not be doubted.
Which, eventually becomes his famous maxim, I think, therefore I am, the ultimate statement of the isolated, rational, waking self.
Yes, the cogito.
But here is the massive irony in the source document. On this freezing night in Bavaria, after months of agonizing over how to establish a purely rational framework for the waking mind, he falls asleep.
And he has a sequence of 3 intensely vivid dreams.
Yeah, and the sequence is highly symbolic. So the first dream, he finds himself walking down a street, but he is beset by these terrifying phantoms.
Right.
And a violent swirling wind kicks up. It's so powerful, he literally cannot walk straight. He's physically blown about, forced to lean heavily on his left side just to keep from falling over.
And he tries to reach a church to pray, but the wind keeps pushing him back.
Yeah. And I mean, it doesn't take a psychoanalyst to see the metaphor there, right? He is experiencing this intense intellectual vertigo in his waking life, a complete lack of solid footing.
Yeah, and his dreaming mind just manifests it as a literal physical storm.
So he wakes up terrified, he prays, and eventually he falls back asleep. Then the second dream hits.
This one is wild. He's in a room, and suddenly there is a massive thunderclap that actually jolts him awake. And as his eyes open, the room around him is just filled with floating sparks of fire.
Which sounds terrifying. But then we get to the third dream, which is really the turning point for modern philosophy.
Yes, the crucial one.
He goes back to sleep, and the storm and the terror are just gone. He finds himself looking at a table with two books on it. One is a dictionary, the other's a poetry anthology called the Corpus Poetarum.
Right.
So he opens the poetry book, and his eyes fall on a very specific line of Latin verse. Quod vitis sectabor eter.
Meaning, what path in life shall I follow?
Exactly. And then a stranger suddenly appears in the dream, handing him another piece of paper with the words, et et non, yes and no.
Which Descartes recognizes as a poem about truth and falsehood by Pythagoras.
Right. Yes. And then the stranger and the books just vanish, and Descartes wakes up.
Now, what matters here isn't just the imagery itself. It is how Descartes chose to interpret it upon waking.
Right, because he didn't just brush it off as a nightmare.
Not at all. He didn't blame it on bad military rations or anything. He interpreted the dictionary as the gathering of all the sciences and the poetry anthology as the revelation of philosophy.
What?
He viewed this entire dream sequence as a direct divine visitation, one that was instructing him to found a completely new science. A science that would unify all human knowledge under a single mathematical method.
Which is just, I mean, let's pause and look at the irony here. The father of rational method, right?
Yeah.
The guy whose entire philosophical legacy is built on the doubting, calculating, solitary, waking mind. He gets his life's mission by completely surrendering his cognition in a dream. It's a staggering paradox. His conscious mind built the fortress of modern reason, but the blueprint was handed to him while he was completely unconscious.
It is a massive paradox, but Descartes himself did not see it as a contradiction.
He didn't.
No, he wrote extensively about these dreams in his private journal, which he called the Olympica. He genuinely believed that the imagination and the dreaming mind could sometimes access truths that pure intellect just could not reach on its own.
That's fascinating.
He understood that the rigid boundary we moderns draw between, rational waking thought and the chaotic dreaming mind, that's an artificial boundary.
But let's clarify the mechanics of what his brain was actually doing here, because I don't want anyone listening to think Descartes just, magically downloaded a philosophical textbook from the ether.
Oh, right.
Okay.
No, the mechanism is crucial to understand. You have to look at the months leading up to the dream. He had been relentlessly saturating his conscious mind with these specific problems.
He was obsessing over it.
Completely obsessing over epistemology and mathematical unity. The dreams did not deliver a solution to a mind that wasn't already primed for it.
So the waking mind basically gathers all the raw materials, but it hits a wall. It gets stuck in a really rigid way of looking at the problem.
Precisely. We often talk about dreams acting as a pressure valve, but we usually mean that in a really dismissive way.
Like blowing off the emotional steam of the day so you don't go crazy.
Exactly. But in the context of discovery, the dream acts as a pressure valve that releases actual insight. The unconscious takes all that saturated, highly pressurized waking material, strips away the conscious mind's rigid biases, reorganizes the data, and presents a path forward.
Okay, I can hear a skeptic listening to this right now and saying, all right, philosophy and finding your life path, those are pretty abstract concepts. It makes sense that a dramatic dream could inspire a young guy to write a book. But we aren't just talking about abstract philosophy today. We are talking about hard, empirical, mathematical science. Does this mechanism actually work when the problem involves test tubes and structural equations?
It absolutely does. And the history of 19th century chemistry provides two of the most robust, undeniable examples of this phenomena.
Yes, these examples are wild.
They really fundamentally challenge our assumptions about the computing power of the sleeping mind. Let's look at Auguste Kekulé in 1865.
Okay, so this is a legendary story in chemistry. Kekulé is trying to solve the molecular structure of benzene. And just to set the stage for you listening, at this time, chemistry is expanding rapidly. They know the ingredients of benzene.
Right. They know it has 6 carbon atoms and 6 hydrogen atoms. That is the empirical data.
But nobody can figure out the architecture. How are these atoms physically connected to each other?
And the waking, logical minds of the top chemists in the world were trapped in a very specific geometrical paradigm.
What do you mean?
They assumed the atoms had to be arranged in straight lines or branching chains. That was just the established grammar of chemical structures at the time.
Ah, I see.
So Kekulé spent years sketching these chains, trying to force the 6 carbons and 6 hydrogens to balance out their valences, but the math simply would not work. The chemical behavior of benzene contradicted every single linear model he drew.
So he is just completely intellectually exhausted. He's sitting in his study in Ghent, dozing in a chair turned toward the fireplace. He falls into a reverie, that twilight space right on the edge of sleep.
Right.
And he starts having a vision. He sees atoms dancing in front of him.
Yeah, he described them as flitting before his eyes, arranging themselves into long rows, twisting and turning in this snake-like motion.
And then, the critical moment.
Oh.
One of the snakes suddenly reaches around, grabs its own tail, and begins whirling mockingly in front of his eyes.
It's such a vivid image.
He wakes up like he's been struck by lightning. He spends the rest of the night working out the mathematical consequences of that image. And the realization is explosive. The benzene molecule is not a straight line. It is a closed ring, a hexagon.
Which is a total paradigm-shifting revelation. The benzene ring became the foundational structure for aromatic chemistry. The entire modern synthetic chemical industry, dyes, plastics, pharmaceuticals, it all relies heavily on the architecture that Kekulé saw dancing in his fireplace.
Which is incredible. He famously told his colleagues later, let us learn to dream, gentlemen, then perhaps we shall find the truth.
A great quote.
But wait, we need to pause here and really look at the image itself, because Kekulé was a 19th century German empirical scientist. He spent his life staring at chalkboards and beakers.
Right.
Yet the image his brain generated a snake eating its own tail, that is the Ouroboros. That is one of the most ancient primal symbols in human history.
Yes, it is.
You find it in ancient Egyptian iconography, in Norse mythology with Jormungandr, in Greek alchemy. It universally symbolizes eternal return, cyclicality, and unity. So why on earth is a chemist dreaming up an ancient mythological symbol to solve a carbon problem?
This is where we cross the bridge from pure chemistry into the depths of psychology. It is the perfect entry point into the framework of Carl Jung.
Okay, let's go there.
If Jung were analyzing Kekulé's dream, he would point to it as a textbook manifestation of what he called the collective unconscious.
Unpack that for us,
Yeah.
because we throw around the word unconscious a lot.
Mhm.
What is the collective unconscious, and how does it differ from just, normal dreaming?
Well, when we talk about the unconscious today, we usually mean the Freudian model, the personal unconscious. Think of it as a dark basement where you store your own repressed childhood memories, your personal fears, your unacknowledged desires.
Stuff that happens specifically to you.
Exactly. But Jung proposed that beneath this personal basement lies a much deeper, vaster cavern. The collective unconscious is a shared, inherited, species-level database.
A species-level database.
Yeah. It doesn't contain specific memories, but rather archetypes. Universal blueprints for images and symbols that all human beings possess simply by virtue of having a human brain.
So you are saying Kekulé didn't invent the snake eating its tail from scratch in his sleep. His brain accessed a pre-existing human template.
Exactly. His conscious waking mind was completely gridlocked by the geometry of straight lines. It could not conceive of a circle in this chemical context because of his training.
Right.
So his dreaming mind bypassed the recent rational layers of thought and reached down into the oldest symbolic vocabulary available to our species. It pulled up the archetype of the closed loop, the Ouroboros, and presented it to his conscious mind.
That is just wow. The symbol and the scientific solution were literally the exact same thing. The brain used a myth to communicate a mathematical truth.
It's brilliant.
But then we have another chemist in the source document, Dmitry Mendeleev, just 4 years later in 1869. And what happens to Mendeleev seems to operate on a totally different mechanical level than Kekulé.
Oh, it absolutely does. If Kekulé's dream was metaphorical and archetypal, Mendeleev's breakthrough demonstrates the sheer brute force computational power of the sleeping brain.
So Mendeleev is trying to bring order to the chaos of the chemical world. He wants to classify all 63 known chemical elements. He has this massive set of cards.
Right.
On each card, he has written an element's atomic weight and its key chemical properties. And he is obsessively playing chemical solitaire, just shuffling these cards day and night, trying to find a master pattern that dictates how the universe organizes matter.
And you have to realize the combinatorial possibilities here are astronomically high.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
His waking mind is trying to cross-reference atomic weights against chemical valences and recurring behaviors. It is simply too much data to hold in working memory at one time.
So his brain is essentially buffering.
Exactly. So on February 17, after a 3-day marathon of shuffling cards and staring at his desk without sleep, he simply collapses. He falls asleep right there in his study.
And while he is asleep, he doesn't dream of a snake. He doesn't get a riddle or a visual metaphor. He dreams the actual completed periodic table of elements.
Yes. He later wrote, "I saw in a dream a table where all the elements fell into place as required. Awakening, I immediately wrote it down on a piece of paper."
Just like that.
The dream organized all 63 elements with astonishing precision, arranging them by atomic weight in a way that revealed the recurring periodic nature of their properties.
Think about the difference here. I like to use this analogy. Kekulé's problem was conceptual. His conscious mind was looking in the wrong direction, so his unconscious handed him a visual riddle, a mythic image, to force him to turn around and see a different geometry.
That's a great way to put it.
But Mendeleev's problem was analytical. He had all the puzzle pieces, but there were too many for his working memory to sort. So his dreaming mind essentially acted like a massive background processor.
Yeah.
While he slept, his brain compiled an incredibly complex multivariable Excel spreadsheet and then just printed out the finished document when he woke up.
The processing speed and sorting capacity of the brain when the waking ego is shut down is staggering. But there is a detail in Mendeleev's story that elevates it from impressive data sorting to something almost, well, prophetic.
Oh, you mean the gaps?
Yes, the gaps. The structure Mendeleev dreamed was so mathematically and logically sound that it didn't just account for the elements they already knew.
Right.
The pattern dictated that there had to be missing pieces. The dream table had literal empty spaces. Mendeleev woke up and, based entirely on the architecture of his dream, confidently stated that there were undiscovered elements that would fit those exact spaces.
He didn't just say, we'll find more stuff eventually. He predicted their atomic weights, their exact densities, and how they would react with other chemicals.
And over the next 15 years, chemists discovered gallium, scandium, and germanium, and their properties matched Mendeleev's dream-born predictions with terrifying accuracy.
Terrifying is the right word. The dreaming mind extrapolated the structural truths of the physical universe. It pushed past the boundary of known science and accurately mapped the unknown.
It's incredible.
But when we hear stories like this today, we tend to categorize them as bizarre anomalies. We tell these anecdotes like they are weird glitches in the matrix of science.
Right, like fun trivia.
Exactly. But if we pull back from the 19th century chemistry lab, we see that relying on dreams is not a quirky phenomenon at all. The source text points out that if you look at the broad scope of human history, treating dreams as a primary instrument of knowledge is actually the default setting for civilization.
This is such a vital perspective shift. For the vast majority of human existence across entirely disconnected geographies, the consensus was that the waking mind was limited,
Yeah.
and the sleeping mind possessed a direct line to deeper truths, whether you call those truths divine, ecological, or psychological. Let's trace this back to the oldest literate civilization we have, Mesopotamia.
Right, so in ancient Sumeria, Assyria, and Babylon, having a dream wasn't like modern times where you wake up and bore your partner over breakfast by saying, I dreamt I was back in high school and forgot my locker combination.
No, not at all.
Dreams were an institution.
They were massive civic and spiritual events. The Mesopotamians believed in a specific dream deity named Mamu, and they developed highly formalized practices around what is known as dream incubation.
Explain dream incubation.
Basically, if you were a ruler facing a military crisis or an individual suffering from a mysterious illness, you didn't rely solely on waking logic to find a solution. You went to a specific temple, underwent a ritual purification process, and slept in a sacred precinct specifically to invite a dream that would solve your problem.
And when you woke up, you didn't just guess at the meaning yourself, you consulted professionals.
Highly trained professionals.
The text points to Assyrian dream manuals from around 1500 BCE, particularly this massive text called the Kekulé. They catalog thousands of specific dream images and their corresponding meanings.
Yeah.
And the mantic priests who interpreted the Baru, they were not sideshow fortune tellers. They held the same esteemed social and intellectual rank as the most elite physicians, mathematicians, or astronomers of their day.
Because the underlying metaphysical assumption of their entire world was that the threshold of sleep is permeable. It is the boundary where human limitation meets divine intelligence. The waking mind deals with the mundane mechanics of survival, but the sleeping mind receives the actual directives of reality.
And we see a very different but equally profound implementation of this idea when we cross the ocean to the indigenous traditions of North America, specifically the Iroquois peoples.
Yes, the source goes into detail here.
They didn't view dreams as external messages from gods, but rather as the deepest, most authentic expression of the human soul.
The Iroquois psychological framework is incredibly sophisticated. They possessed a concept called ondanok.
Ondanok.
Right, which essentially refers to the secret desires or truths of the soul that the waking ego suppresses or ignores. They recognized centuries before Freud that our conscious, everyday waking self is heavily filtered by social expectations and practical demands.
So if your waking life is a mask, your dream life is when the mask comes off. The dream is the language of the soul trying to tell you what you actually need to be whole.
Exactly.
But what fascinates me is how they handled this collectively. If a member of the Iroquois community had a vivid dream, it wasn't viewed as a private psychological issue to be dealt with in isolation.
Not at all. It was a communal responsibility. During major events like the Midwinter Festival, individuals would share their dreams and the entire community would mobilize to help enact or fulfill the meaning of that dream.
That's amazing.
So if you dreamt of a specific feast, the community held that feast. If you dreamt of a symbolic conflict, they might act it out in a ritualized way.
It's essentially large-scale, community-supported psychoanalysis through theater.
That's exactly what it is. And the stakes were incredibly high. They believed that to ignore a significant dream was a profound act of self-betrayal.
Oh.
Yeah, if the soul's desires, the Andinank, were chronically denied, it would manifest as literal physical or mental illness. The community intervened to ensure that the individual integrated the truths revealed in sleep, maintaining both personal health and social harmony.
That is such a beautiful way to organize a society, just taking the unconscious that seriously. But to see the most expansive view of dreaming in human history, the document says we have to look at the Australian Aboriginal concept of the dream time, or Jukurpa.
Yes,
This completely redefines the word dream.
it does. It takes the concept from a psychological tool to a cosmological foundation. In Aboriginal ontology, the dream time is not the state of being asleep. And importantly, it is not merely the ancient past, like some historical creation myth.
Right.
It is the eternal underlying architecture of reality itself.
It is the source code of the universe.
Yeah.
It contains the laws of nature, the creation of the landscape, the behavior of animals, and the moral codes of humanity.
Exactly.
And the crucial part is that this source code is always running in the background. It is an ever-present dimension.
Modern Westerners operate in linear time, past, present, future. The dream time is everywhen. It is constantly occurring.
Every win. I love that.
And certain states of consciousness, specifically deep sleep, trance, and ritual, allow an individual to briefly slip out of linear waking time and access this foundational layer of reality. The songlines that cross the Australian continent are physical maps of this dreaming reality.
You know, when you look at the Mesopotamians, the Iroquois, and the Aboriginal Australians, you are looking at vastly different cultures, separated by oceans and millennia.
Right.
Yet they all arrived at the exact same foundational consensus. The waking mind is a limited interface, and the sleeping mind is the gateway to a broader, truer reality. It really makes our modern Enlightenment attitude look incredibly arrogant.
He really does.
We assume we're the only civilization in history that figured out how thinking works, simply because we invented the microchip.
It forces a necessary humility, for sure. But if we are going to bridge the gap between ancient cultural reverence and modern scientific skepticism, we need a mechanism. How does modern psychology actually explain the biology or the mechanics of accessing this hidden layer without just, throwing up our hands and calling it magic?
Let's bring Carl Jung back into the conversation to explain the actual grammar of the unconscious, because Jung gives us a framework that bridges the mystical and the scientific. We need to talk about what he called the compensatory function of dreams.
Yes, the compensatory function. To understand this, you first have to understand the inherent limitations of waking consciousness. By its very nature, the waking mind must exclude information in order to function.
What do you mean by exclude?
Well, if you are a chemist trying to balance an equation, you cannot simultaneously be processing your grief over a lost relative, the beautiful color of the sunset outside your window, and a memory from when you were 5 years old.
Right, you go crazy.
Exactly. To achieve focus, your brain must build walls.
I think of the waking mind as a tightly focused spotlight. A spotlight is incredibly bright, and it is highly effective at illuminating exactly what is directly in front of you. But because it is so intense and narrow, it plunges everything else around it into absolute darkness.
That is a phenomenal metaphor.
The more intensely you focus the spotlight, the darker the periphery gets.
Yes. The waking mind categorizes what is relevant and rigorously suppresses everything else as irrelevant noise. But the problem with the spotlight is that complex problems often require lateral connections.
Like Mendeleev's periodic table.
Exactly. They require you to see the relationships between things that seem totally unrelated.
So how does the dream compensate for this?
When you fall asleep, the focused spotlight of the waking ego is turned off. The dream state operates more like a dim floodlight. It might not have the razor-sharp intensity of waking logic, but it illuminates the entire forest.
Oh, I see.
It reveals the hidden pathways and lateral connections that your waking mind actively suppressed. The dream compensates for the rigidity of your conscious attitude by showing you exactly what your blind spots are hiding.
Let's tie that directly to our scientists. So Mendeleev's waking spotlight was blindingly intense. He was staring at those cards, trying to force them into known chemical categories. He created a psychological gridlock through sheer effort.
Yes.
By passing out at his desk, he turned off the spotlight. The floodlight came on, the walls came down, and his brain was suddenly free to notice the broader, more subtle patterns that his waking fixation had blocked out.
Exactly. The waking mind builds the walls, and the dreaming mind acts as a necessary solvent, dissolving those walls to restore balance. This leads directly into another core Jungian mechanism, the transcendent function.
The transcendent function. Let's break that down for the listener because it sounds a bit academic, but it's actually describing the literal spark of genius.
It is. Jung observed that the human psyche has an inherent drive toward wholeness. It constantly seeks to reconcile opposites. You have the conscious mind with its known facts, and the unconscious mind with its vast reservoir of symbols and hidden connections. The transcendent function is the psychological mechanism that builds a bridge between the two.
It takes the thesis of the waking mind and the antithesis of the sleeping mind and synthesizes them into something entirely new.
Yes. Think about it. It takes Descartes' terrifying confusion and synthesizes it with the archetype of divine calling to produce a unified method.
Right.
It takes Kekulé's straight lines and synthesizes them with the mythic Ouroboros to produce the hexagonal ring. The transcendent function does not just deliver a missing piece of data, it reorganizes your entire understanding of what is possible.
It elevates the mind to a new vantage point where the unsolvable problem suddenly makes perfect sense.
Precisely.
Okay, up to this point in our deep dive, the dynamic we've been describing sounds incredibly harmonious.
Too harmonious, maybe.
Yeah. You do your waking work, you get stuck, you go to sleep, the floodlight turns on, the transcendent function builds a lovely bridge, and you wake up with a Nobel Prize or a unified philosophy of human knowledge. It sounds like a gift.
Right.
But this is but the source document we are analyzing takes a very sharp, dark turn here.
It does. It introduces a vital caveat. While the unconscious can be a source of profound, gentle insight, engaging with the deep architecture of the psyche is not always a tidy or safe process.
No.
Sometimes it is a violent struggle. It is not just about solving intellectual puzzles. It is about confronting the self.
And to illustrate this darker, more demanding aspect of the night, the text pulls us completely out of the world of organic chemistry and drops us into ancient scripture.
Yes, segment 5.
It focuses on the biblical story of Jacob wrestling at the ford of Jabbok from Genesis chapter 32. Now, acting as a proxy for the modern listener, I have to ask, why are we suddenly talking about a guy from the Bible wrestling an angel? What does ancient scripture have to do with cognitive breakthroughs and the unconscious mind?
It's a fair question. We're looking at the Jacob narrative not as literal history, but as an archetypal model. Just as the Ouroboros gave us a map for cyclical geometry, the story of Jacob gives us the most accurate psychological map of what it feels like to undergo deep structural transformation in the liminal spaces of the mind.
Okay.
It illustrates what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow.
Let's set the scene at the Jabbok first, and then break down the psychology. What is happening to Jacob on this specific night?
Jacob is in a state of absolute existential terror. He's traveling back to his homeland and is about to face his estranged brother Esau.
And they do not have a good relationship.
No. Years earlier, Jacob had deceived his father and stolen Esau's birthright and blessing. He knows Esau is marching toward him right now with an army of 400 men.
So he thinks he's going to die.
Jacob is anticipating violence, perhaps death. In his fear, he sends his wives, his children, and all his possessions across the river Jabbok. He strips away everything that tethers him to his waking identity, and he remains alone on the riverbank in the dark.
He is completely isolated. He is in a liminal space, a boundary line between his past and his terrifying future.
And in the middle of the night, a figure appears. The biblical text is wonderfully ambiguous here. It calls him a man, but later implies it is an angel or perhaps God himself.
Right.
This stranger attacks Jacob, and they engage in a brutal physical wrestling match that lasts the entire night, all the way until dawn.
They're locked in combat in the dark. Neither can gain the upper hand.
As dawn approaches, the stranger sees that he cannot overpower Jacob, so he strikes Jacob's hip socket, permanently wrenching it out of joint.
Ouch.
Despite this crippling physical wound, Jacob refuses to let go. He clings to his attacker and says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me."
The audacity of that. You are crippled, fighting a supernatural force, and you demand a blessing.
And he receives it. The stranger asks Jacob his name. When Jacob replies, the stranger gives him a new identity. He says, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Jacob survives, names the place Peniel, meaning "I have seen God face to face," and the sun rises. But the text adds a crucial final detail.
The limp.
Yes. As he crosses the river to join his family, he is limping because of his hip. He carries the wound into the daylight.
Now, let's map this onto the psychology of the deep unconscious. How does this terrifying physical struggle represent the cognitive processes we've been talking about?
Jacob's isolation on the riverbank perfectly mirrors the hypnagogic state, that blurry twilight boundary between waking logic and the depths of sleep. And the stranger he wrestles with represents what Jung called the shadow.
Let's unpack the shadow. What actually is the shadow in modern psychological terms?
The shadow consists of all the aspects of your personality, your desires, and your history that your conscious ego refuses to acknowledge. It is the repository of your guilt, your suppressed trauma, your unacceptable ambitions, and your moral failures.
Oh, wow.
Jacob's conscious ego saw himself as a patriarch favored by God. His shadow held the reality that he was a deceiver, a usurper who ruined his brother's life.
He had to face what he'd done.
On the banks of the Jabbok, in the isolation of the night, his conscious defenses fell away, and he was forced into a direct confrontation with the darkest, most terrifying truths about himself.
So, unlike Mendeleev, who was just trying to organize data, Jacob is trying to integrate his own fractured identity.
Exactly. Jung called this process individuation. It is the painful, demanding work of integrating the shadow into your conscious life to achieve true psychological wholeness.
You cannot become fully yourself until you stop running from the parts of yourself you fear the most.
Exactly. And that explains the profound difference in the outcome. Descartes and Mendeleev woke up with clarity. They were handed answers. Jacob woke up with a limp.
Breakthroughs in this deep liminal space aren't just informational, they are transformational.
And transformation inherently requires destruction. To become Israel, the identity of Jacob had to be broken. You cannot encounter the deepest layers of reality or the darkest corners of your own psyche and expect to walk away completely unchanged.
The limp is the physical manifestation of psychological integration.
It proves the encounter was real. It reminds us that engaging with the unknown is not a casual parlor trick to boost productivity. It demands a sacrifice of your old worldview.
It is a profound warning. It elevates the entire concept of the dream from a mere problem-solving tool to an arena where your very identity is forged.
Absolutely.
Well, we have traveled a massive intellectual distance today, from a freezing room in 17th century Bavaria to the chemical laboratories of the 19th century.
You really have.
We've looked at ancient Mesopotamian temples, Iroquois community festivals, the cosmological Aboriginal Dreamtime, and the muddy banks of the River Jabbok. Now, I want to bring this all the way down to earth for you, the listener.
Practical application time.
Yes. How do you actually apply this to your modern busy life? If you are stuck on a project at work or struggling with a creative block or facing a personal crisis, how do you unlock these unseen doors without having to wrestle an angel and throw out your hip?
The source document does something very helpful here. It distills a highly practical pattern from all the scientific and historical cases we've discussed. It offers what we can think of as a recipe for incubation.
A recipe for incubation.
Okay.
And the very first step of this recipe is a reality check. You cannot simply demand a genius dream on a whim.
Right. You can't just lay your head on the pillow, snap your fingers, and say, "Hey, unconscious mind, please invent a billion-dollar app for me tonight so I can quit my job. Thanks. Good night."
It doesn't work like a vending machine.
No.
The waking mind must do the heavy lifting first. The recurring pattern in every single story we've looked at is saturation. You have to immerse yourself in the problem.
You have to feed the unconscious mind the raw material it needs to work with.
Yes. Think about it. Descartes obsessed over philosophy for months. Kekulé sketched chemical chains for years. Mendeleev played his chemical solitaire for days straight without sleeping. You have to study, research, calculate, and struggle until your conscious mind absolutely hits a brick wall. You focus the spotlight until the bulb burns out. You do the hard waking work. But then comes the second, and arguably more difficult step. Once you hit the wall, You have to surrender.
This is the crucial pivot. You place the problem in the warmth of the unconscious, like an egg in an incubator, and you walk away.
You stop trying to force the solution with your conscious will.
Yes.
It's that moment when you decide, you know what? I am not going to stare at this spreadsheet for another hour. I am going to bed.
That surrender is the mechanism that takes off the horse blinders. It turns off the blinding spotlight and allows the floodlight of the unconscious to turn on and illuminate the lateral connections.
And when the insight finally arrives, the text points out a fascinating phenomenological detail that runs through all these accounts. The solution feels received, not constructed.
Yes, the feeling of givenness.
The dreamers never feel like they actively solved the problem in their sleep. They feel like the solution was handed to them by a third party. And the text brings in a couple of brief, modern examples to prove that this givenness happens everywhere, not just in Victorian chemistry labs. Look at Otto Loewy, the brilliant pharmacologist.
Loewy's story is the perfect example of this givenness. In 1921, he is trying to prove a highly controversial theory that nerve impulses are transmitted via chemicals, not just electrical sparks.
Right.
He has the theory, but he cannot conceive of the experiment to prove it.
So he goes to sleep, and in the middle of the night, he dreams the exact step-by-step experimental design needed to prove chemical neurotransmission using frog hearts.
Frog hearts, yes.
He wakes up, scribbles it down on a piece of paper on his nightstand, and goes back to sleep. He wakes up the next morning, looks at the paper, and realizes he cannot read his own midnight handwriting.
It is the ultimate nightmare for a scientist. He knows he had the answer, but it is gone.
He spends the whole day in absolute agony. But the next night, he goes to sleep, and the dream actually comes back. The unconscious hands him the experiment a second time.
Wow.
This time, he doesn't risk writing it down. He gets up, puts his clothes on, goes straight to the laboratory at 3 in the morning, performs the experiment exactly as the dream instructed, and it works perfectly. That experiment eventually wins him the Nobel Prize in medicine.
The dream literally gave her the procedure. And we see the exact same phenomenon in the creative arts. Think about Paul McCartney and the creation of the song Yesterday, one of the most covered songs in the history of recorded music.
McCartney wakes up one morning in a flat in London, and he has the entire complete melody of Yesterday playing vividly in his head.
Right.
He walks over to a piano and figures out the chords. But his reaction is what is so telling. He was absolutely convinced that he did not write it.
He felt the melody was given to him. He thought he must have heard it years ago, and it was just resurfacing as a memory.
He spent weeks walking around the London music scene, playing the melody for other musicians, asking, hey, have you heard this before? Did I accidentally steal this from an old jazz record?
He could not accept that his brain generated something so perfect without his conscious effort. He was just the vessel.
What all these examples, Loewy, McCartney, Kekulé, what they teach us is a vital lesson in respecting our waking limits.
Waking consciousness works within necessary constraints. It relies on logic, categories, and firm assumptions about what is impossible.
Right.
We need those limits to cross the street, pay our bills, and survive in the physical world.
The waking mind keeps us from walking off cliffs.
Exactly. The practical takeaway here is to honor the necessity of that waking effort, but to cultivate a deep, abiding trust that the dreaming mind operates by entirely different rules, completely free from those constraints.
We have to stop treating sleep as an annoying biological tax we have to pay, and start treating it as the most advanced, high-power laboratory and creative studio we possess.
That is exactly right.
To summarize the incredible journey we've been on today, we began with René Descartes, watching him find the vocation of modern reason in a dream of flying sparks and floating dictionaries.
We saw Auguste Kekulé bypass the limits of 19th century geometry by decoding the benzene ring through the ancient mythic symbol of the Ouroboros.
We watched Dmitri Mendeleev's exhausted brain compile a flawless, predictive spreadsheet of the universe while he slept at his desk.
We explored how ancient civilizations, from the purification temples of Mesopotamia to the psychological theater of the Iroquois and the cosmological landscape of the Aboriginal Dreamtime, understood this nocturnal reality as a fundamental truth.
And we sat with the heavy reality of Jacob's struggle at the River Jabbok, learning that true insight sometimes demands a painful integration of our darkest shadows, leaving a permanent mark.
Every single one of them lay down with a problem, and all of them woke up possessing knowledge they did not have the day before.
They allowed the transcendent function to bridge the massive gap between what their waking minds knew and what their souls or their sciences desperately needed to know.
Beautifully said.
And that leads us to the final profound ambiguity that the source text leaves us with. And I want to deliver this directly to you, the listener. The text points out that whether these dreams are purely internal cognitive events, just your neurons efficiently organizing files and accessing archetypal memories, or whether they actually represent genuine contact with a deeper external dimension of reality, is a question that neither neuroscience nor theology has definitively settled.
The document concludes with a phenomenal punchline that lingers in the mind. It suggests it may be that the distinction between waking reality and dreaming is much less stable than we suppose.
That is the thought I want to leave you with today. The boundary is permeable. Something incredibly powerful, incredibly creative, and sometimes terrifyingly insightful moves through the sleeping mind.
Yes.
So as you turn off the lights and go to bed tonight, ask yourself, what problem have you been stubbornly trying to force your way through with your waking mind that you finally just need to surrender to the night?
Good night, everyone.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.